All right. So, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is March 31st, 2025, about 10 p.m. where I'm at right now, and we are continuing our reading of our new book, our 10th book in our Book to React series. This is part 2 of Racism in Europe by Professor Neil MacMaster of East Anglia University, a white man who wrote a book about the history of anti-blackness and anti-Semitism in Europe. And we began this book yesterday on my live stream, and I'm very excited to get through all of these pages and react to this book live in front of y'all and have conversations with the people in the chat. So if you're in the chat, I got my phone right here. I will be reading every comment that comes through. Yesterday, we had some very good comments from some people that came through, and they started arguing about evolution and if evolution actually makes species transition into other species. If y'all want to debate that in the comment section, y'all can go ahead. If you have any questions for me or comments for me or book suggestions for me, put it in the comments as well. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff on this channel, but before we jump into this book, I have to say subscribe to Backpack Bandits, the travel channel I have with my wife. Subscribe to Culturalist Theory, where I do write-ups on artists' catalog, ranking them from best to worst. So check that out as well. Support everything I'm doing on YouTube, and let's continue here. So this book you can find on Amazon. It was published in 2001, and you can get it for the humble price in paperback of only $22.52, $66 hardcover. This is a rare book to find, hard book to find, little known book for a little covered topic, unfortunately. But that's why we read these books. We're bringing the information to the people and making it available. So we started in the introduction in our last reading, and today we're only reading two parts: the origins of a science of race, and I believe the 1870 revolution, basically when the modern world started to come into being, and how race played a part in building the modern world. So let's get into it. The remainder of this introductory chapter sets out to explore in more detail the conditions under which a typically modern form of racism began to spread within European society from the 1860s to 70s onwards. To understand the nature of the new racial paradigm requires some examination of the earlier forms of racism that were about to undergo a major shift or reformulation. A true science of race, an attempt to classify the human species into a range of differing biological subgroups, did not emerge clearly until the 18th century with the work of thinkers like Linnaeus, Buffon, and Blumenbach. Most of them sound German. The age of the Enlightenment was one in which self-confident reason set out to impose order on the natural world by elaborating systems of classification that would enable the underlying structures and patterns of the material universe, regulated by the laws of nature, to be identified and analyzed. The scientific work of the Swede Linnaeus involved a vast scheme, an epistemological project to systematize knowledge of the teeming chaos of animal and plant forms through a coherent system of classification that would establish the underlying biological similarities of species and types. The great breakthroughs of Linnaeus in the Systema Naturae, 1735, was to classify man in the same order of quadrupeds as the ape and sloth, a revolutionary step that broke with Genesis and a scriptural interpretation of the place of man within a divine order, and located him zoologically as part of the animal world. In the second edition of 1740, he went on to subdivide man into 4 races, according to skin color: the white European, the dark Asian, the black African, and the red American. However, a more representative figure of the science of race was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, 1752-1840, a professor of anatomy at Göttingen, regarded as the father of modern anthropology. In the third edition of On the Natural Variety of Mankind, published in 1795, Blumenbach divided mankind into 5 races, including the famous white Caucasian. But most crucially, he upheld the theory of monogenesis as had Linnaeus and Buffon. It's so funny that Buffon can also be said as buffoon, which I will probably refer to him as later, as he is mentioned. But I have to say, it's so crazy that we're still calling white people Caucasian, because from my understanding, the guy who's the father, Blumenbach, the father of modern anthropology, literally just made up this idea that, all white people were descended from a group of ancient Aryans who lived in the mountains of the Caucasus in, Central Asia, stuff like that, like right below Russia, like where Georgia is today, where the Chechens live and stuff like that, where Dagestan is. That's where all white folks come from. He literally just made this up, and still we still call white people Caucasian today. Let's continue here. So, monogenesis, the defining mark of European racial ideology between circa 1750 and 1850, upheld the descent of all races from a single original group, and in doing so was in conformity with both biblical tradition and with the Enlightenment concept of the essential unity or brotherhood of man. Blumenbach thought that the different races had evolved from a common ancestral group, which was characteristically white, through a process of degeneration and the accumulative impact of differing climate, diet, disease, and mode of life. His contention that, regardless of race, men are all related or only differ from each other in degree was an essential component of the humanitarian racism that remained dominant down to the mid-19th century, and I would argue still exists today. I still think most people believe that races are a real thing. They believe that in your blood, in your DNA, you are Turkish, you are Russian, you are a black African in your DNA, and that is essentially a part of who you are. But even if that is essentially a part of who you are, it doesn't make that much difference because we're all one family, but people still believe in races, and that's the big problem. Let's continue here. The period from the late 18th century down to circa 1860-1870 was one in which most European thinkers emphasized the shared characteristics and fundamental equality of all mankind. The Enlightenment, as well as the American and French revolutions, promoted the values of a universal humanism through which all men, regardless of class, religion, color, or nationality, shared the same essential being and fundamental rights. This was also the age of emancipation, which saw the gradual extension of the abolition of the slave trade and slavery between 1794 and 1865, as well as the civil and political emancipation of the Jews, France 1789, Belgium 1830, Prussia 1850, Austria-Hungary 1867, Germany 1871. That's so crazy to think that, the emancipation of the Jews, which is crazy in and of itself, just to even think they needed to be emancipated from the years, the centuries of oppression that had been visited upon them. It came around the same time that trains were invented. Trains were invented before the Jews got their freedom. That's crazy. So, a few thinkers during this period did come up with radical forms of racial difference, but the main drive of the age was towards a view of human progress in which eventually even the most primitive peoples would receive the benefits of civilization and Christianity. Blumenbach was a representative figure of the age of enlightenment and progress, and expounded a tolerant racial science. Negroes, for example, usually viewed as at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, he found to have a good disposition, and they can scarcely be considered inferior to any other race of mankind taken together. They would show the same natural tenderness of heart as other peoples, as long as this sentiment has never been benumbed or extirpated on board the transport vessels or on the West India sugar plantations by the brutality of their white executioners. Okay, all right, well, shout out Blumenbach for saying that. He's saying essentially black people are no different than white people if any of these categories are real, and they can be kind too, they can be gentle too, they can be normal people unless we decide to brutalize them and bring them to the slave plantations in Jamaica. So, this was a classic abolitionist position. If blacks seemed inferior and morally vicious, this had nothing to do with innate racial characteristics, but with the damaging effects of slavery. Remove this evil and Africans would be as perfectible as Europeans. From 1850 onwards, European society began to show evidence of a shift towards a more intolerant racism that constructed more radical biological differences between groups. A distinguishing feature of the ideological formation of the emergent modern racism was that it set out to create radically impermeable boundaries between races. The British anatomist Robert Knox can be taken as an early precursor of this shift. In The Races of Men, published in 1850, he placed an absolute biological division between races, such that it was impossible for any interbreeding to result in lasting hybrid or mixed types. History could show that each race had remained absolutely unchanged over thousands of years, regardless of nationality, climate, migrations, or other conditions. Knox's theory was founded on a racial determinism. The laws of nature dictated that the Negro was irrevocably inferior to the Saxon race, the highest type, and was lacking in the major qualities which distinguish man from the animal. Among them the power of pure reason and the ability to observe new phenomena and new relations. In several passages, he suggested that the fair Saxon race, a tall, powerful, athletic race of men, the strongest as a race on earth, was inevitably bound to exterminate the weaker, dark races. This had already taken place with the Tasmanians, and although this was perhaps regrettable as a cruel, cold-blooded, heartless deed, Knox did not regard extermination as an ethical or religious issue. This was simply the playing out of the inexorable laws of nature. You know, what's sad is that, that this idea still permeates to some degree. I would say it permeates amongst the far-right nationalists and white identitarians out there that, yes, white people are destined to rule and that the other races of people will either be their servants, their slaves, or will be eliminated. Unfortunately, this idea still exists, right? And unfortunately, it exists also in the minds of some black folks who, think the white man's ice is colder or have white supremacist thinking. Let's continue here. Knox's theories were characteristic of the modern race science that became dominant between 1870 and 1914. A number of features distinguish the transition to the distinctive modern form of racism. Firstly, so all-determining was the theory of race that it provided the universal key to an understanding of the whole of human history as well as of the contemporary social and political order. Race, claimed Knox, is everything: literature, science, art, in a word, civilization depends on it. And in human history, race is everything. Words echoed in Disraeli's famous bon mot, race is all. Okay, that's all right, you tripping. From the mid-19th century onwards, a race science became the dominant epistemology, a tool for the unlocking of every conceivable social, cultural, and political phenomenon, and the discourse of race infiltrated gender, class, and nation. Don't ever let white folks say, y'all think about race too much. Y'all talk about race too much. Y'all think race is all. These are literally the words out of their prime thinkers, the men of the Enlightenment. They teach us about the Enlightenment in middle school, high school, all this sort of stuff. What did the men of the Enlightenment say? Race is everything. Everything comes down to people's skin color. This is what the white supremacists said. The great white thinkers that they look up to and make us examine on PowerPoints and read about in history books, this is what they had to say about race. They thought about race too much. Race is all. What is wrong with y'all? Anyway, continuing here. Knox's work was prophetic of a deepening crisis in late 19th century liberalism, an atmosphere of growing European intolerance and inherent superiority towards minority peoples. For example, in his offhand dismissal of the hideous, lazy, and baboon-like Hottentot and Bosman races, Knox asked if they were doomed. I suppose so. They will soon form merely natural curiosities. Already there is the skin of one stuffed in England and another in Paris. Although Knox did not use the term polygenesis, the idea of the totally separate and fixed characteristics of races was implicit throughout his work, a theoretical position that broke away from both the Christian tradition of descent from Adam with its connotations of a shared humanity, as well as the scientific monogenesis of the Enlightenment and the concept of the universality of man. As Nancy Stepan has shown, such an emphasis on the fundamental heterogeneity of mankind remained the dominant racial discourse throughout the period 1850 to 1945. In spite of the implications of Darwin's theories, which demonstrated the evolutionary interconnectedness of the human species, the idea of the fixed and immutable quality of race lent itself more readily to a racist praxis that emphasized a hierarchy of superior and inferior types, and the radical segregation, exclusion, or domination of lower forms. Knox also pointed towards the future trends into racial science in his emphasis on the existence of distant races internal to Europe. The humanistic racism of the Enlightenment tradition that was dominant from 1750 to 1850 deployed a simple demarcation of global population into a few categories, most commonly European, white, African, black, American, red, and Asian, yellow. Sounds like a Stevie Wonder song. In this system, the people of Europe were presented as a homogeneous bloc, Homo Europaeus albus. Knox, however, argued that Europe was divided internally into a range of races, Saxons, Celt, Slavonian, Sarmatian, etc., that were just as distinctive as Red Indians, Hottentots, and other savages. Moreover, the dynamics of contemporary history could be interpreted as a struggle between these European groups, a war of race against race. This shift in physical anthropology after 1850, which can be linked to a growing form of aggressive nationalism and interstate tension that divided Europe, is of importance to the emergence of two quite different forms of racism. One that was directed towards others who were seen as essentially outside the borders of European society, anti-black colonial racism, and another more paranoid form that targeted alien groups that were located inside Europe, embedded within the heart of the host society. The classic instance of the enemy within was the Jew. Here again, Knox was innovative in his categorization of Jews as a distinct biological race. During the Age of Emancipation, 1782 to 1871, that's still funny to me. The Age of Emancipation for Jews went on for close to 100 years. Anyway, the Jews were seen as primarily a religious and cultural group, and it was a basic premise of emancipation that they could indeed become fully integrated and even assimilated into the national majority group. However, from the late 1860s onwards, the Jews were increasingly defined not only as an alien presence within the nation, a state within the state, but as a quite distinct racial group that would remain eternally separate from the people of Europe. Christian tradition had defined the Jew as a deicide, as a living rejection of revelation. But at the same time, the church maintained the possibility of conversion and even associated the final conversion of the Jewish people within Christian eschatology. That means essentially, as he says here, the millennium and the return of Christ. Many Christians started to believe at the time, after reading their holy books, that Jesus will come back when the Jews all convert to Christianity. Or, when the Jews do all convert to Christianity, that will be a sign of the end times. It's either one of those two. Now, scientific forms of racism meant that the Jews would always remain Jews, locked into the hereditary destiny of their races. Johannes Norman, in The Jew and the German State, 1861, provided an early example of this new form of thinking that, from 1879, was to be denoted by the neologism anti-Semitism. According to Norman, the closed character of the Jewish community and marriage endogamy has allowed a distinct racial minority to survive unassimilated in Europe. Seclusion and inbreeding over many thousand years strengthened the thorough domination of the race type and made the way of thought a part of it. Jewish blood and Jewish sentiment became inseparable, and we have to conceive of Judaism not only as a religion and congregation, but also as the expression of racial peculiarity. Wilhelm Marr, the leading anti-Semitic theorist, emphasized that in the new approach, befitting a secular age of scientific progress and inquiry, there must be no question here of parading religious prejudices when it is a question of race and when the differences lie in the blood. I got into an argument in class because I'm a sociology student right now here in Budapest, Hungary. I got into a major argument with one of my teachers in class. He's an anthropology professor, and he was trying to push this notion to this class of like 50 kids, I don't know, maybe even 80 kids, that racism essentially started with the transportation of the black African to the Americas. And before then, there was no such thing as the essentialization of people. But for hundreds of years in Europe, they essentialized the Jew and said that the Jew had Jewish blood. The Jew was a specific type of person. The Jew was a separate race than the whites of Europe, whatever they may be, whether they're French, German, British, whatever. The Jew was essentialized. The Romani or the the gypsy was essentialized as having a blood type or a phenotype or a specific type of character that made them separate. It's a lie when white folks say that racism started in the United States. It's a lie when white folks say racism started with the transatlantic slave trade. It's a lie when white folks say racism began with colonialism, because they were already doing essentialization of people in Europe for hundreds of years with Jews and Romanis. Period. Look at the Inquisition. Even if you were a Jewish person that converted to Christianity, they said you're not really Christian because you have Jewish blood. And that was hundreds of years before they even made it to the Americas. So let's continue here. The period from the 1870s onwards witnessed a European-wide reaction among the bourgeoisie against liberal humanism and against the political movements that had seen the final emancipation of black slaves and of the Jews. In both instances, the radical difference between Europeans and the other was naturalized, a difference built into the biological essence of each group. Let's repeat that sentence. In both instances, the radical difference between Europeans and the other, whether they be Jews or black people, was naturalized, a difference built into the biological essence of each group. The absolute boundary between each race was constructed as a scientific theory, and hence, in a secular age when purely religious interpretations of the world were being sapped by materialism, such racial forms of thinking would have appealed to growing numbers of the educated classes and provided a powerful form of legitimation for such concepts. The modern form of racism was spreading simultaneously, both across the maritime colonial states of Western Europe in an anti-black form, as well as across swath Eastern Europe, primarily in the form of anti-Semitism. Don't ever let them tell you that there was no anti-black racism in Western Europe before black folks started coming over in mass. Don't ever let them tell you that, because this is not true. It's not true. Let's continue here. So far, we have tended to examine the emergence of modern racism from earlier forms in terms of ideas, of Blumenbach, Knox, and others. However, as has been argued, it would be a great mistake to try and interpret the synchronicity of modern racism, its simultaneous appearance across the face of Europe as a consequence of the spread and impact of new ideas. It was rarely the case that thinkers, even the most sophisticated scientists like Darwin, discovered biological truths about race that even simply spread into society, but rather there was an inverse relationship in which scientific racism tended to reflect the general beliefs and values of the wider society and the changes it was undergoing. Ideas of race were not a cause, but more frequently an expression of racism. The construction of race was achieved through a system of marking and stigmatization, of generating taxonomies that deepened crucially on the naturalization of group difference, the process through which genetically superficial differences, usually the most visible and external qualities of skin tone, hair texture, height, and facial features, became symbolic markers or signifiers for not only racial categorization, but also for essential forms of moral, mental, and cultural inferiority, was central to modern racism. The founding race theorists like Linnaeus and Blumenbach, as we have seen, elaborated complex systems of classification that divided human beings into distinct groups using primarily the methods of comparative physical anthropology. Most race theorists, from Linnaeus to Gobineau, were armchair anthropologists who formed their ideas not from the direct observation of native peoples, but from the accounts of travelers, missionaries, sailors, soldiers, explorers, from their drawings, and the close measurement of skeletons, and in particular of human skulls. Let's remember that basically the inventors of anthropology, sociology, were like Reddit and 4chan users of their day. Guys who basically lived in their mama's basement and read the accounts of missionaries who went to Australia and Africa and the Americas and came back, and they picked up those books that those people wrote and said, yep, we're going to divide the world into different races. They never even left their house, never even left their countries. Blumenbach was quite typical. He never traveled further than Switzerland, Holland, England, and France, and his main scientific technique was a classification of what he called the Golgotha, his private collection of 245 skulls imported from around the world. That's sick. Where are those skulls now? That's disgusting. Why would you keep a bunch of skulls of different people? The physical anthropologists, whose approach remained dominant between the mid-18th century and the early years of the 20th century, classified each race type using a scientific language that listed the main component features of skin, eye color, hair type, skull shape, and other somatic features. Blumenbach described the African or Ethiopian race as follows: color black, hair black and curly, head narrow, compressed at the sides, forehead knotty, uneven, molar bones protruding outwards, eyes very prominent, nose thick, mixed up as it were with the wide jaws, alveolar edge narrows, elongated in front, the upper primaries obliquely prominent, the lips, especially the upper, very puffy, chin retreating. While such a seemingly objective and rational language would appear to constitute the very core of racist scientific methodology, this impression is illusory. The crucial message of these scientists lay not in the typology, but in the aesthetic, moral, and cultural characteristics which were slipped in and attached to each somatic type. Linnaeus, for example, tabulated and classified the African as follows: black, phlegmatic, relaxed, hair black, frizzled, skin silky, nose flat, lips tumid. Women without shame. Mame lactate profusely, crafty, indolent, negligent. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. I'm gonna say that every morning I put on lotion. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. That's hard. I like that. I'm gonna lotion. Wear that lotion, man. I'm gonna put that lotion on right now. Hold on, wait. Covered by grease. Anoints himself with grease. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. That's my shit, cause that's a bar. I'm sorry. I just wanted to smell like cocoa butter now. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. Anyway, so let's continue. I can't. All right. The key racial element here lies not in the physical markers. These can be quite natural, but in the qualities to which they are attached. Africans are shameless, crafty, indolent, negligent, capricious. The scientists did not discover such qualities by direct observation of Africans, but through numerous and often lurid or highly subjective accounts of travelers that lay to hand in the libraries of Europe. The rare ideologues thus picked up the pre-existing prejudices and stereotypical attitudes of European and white colonial societies, repackaged them as scientific theory, and then mirrored them back to a literate public. A century and a half after Linnaeus, physical anthropologists were still operating in an identical way. A.H. Keane, professor at University College London and a leading expert on race at the turn of the century, in his popular Man, Past and Present, 1899, provided a taxonomy which included a description of racial temperament. The Sudanese Negroes were sensuous, indolent, improvident, fitful, passionate, and cruel, though often affectionate and faithful, little sense of dignity and slight self-consciousness. Doesn't that sound like a contradiction? Anyway, hence easy acceptance of yoke of slavery, musical. While the southern Mongols were somewhat sluggish with little initiative but great endurance, cunning rather than intelligent, generally thrifty and industrious, but most indolent in Siam and Burma, moral standards low with slight sense of right and wrong. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, racist stereotypes of the black operated with an unchanging and restricted repertoire of characteristics, a list that was repeated ad nauseum in newspapers, novels, travel writings, barroom jokes, children's adventure books, encyclopedias, advertisements, and vaudeville. The black was generally described as lewd and oversexed, lazy, diseased, dirty, of low intelligence, childlike, requiring supervision, violent, immoral, lying, and thieving. Race scientists did not then use some advanced methodology to locate the essential inferiority of the black, but rather they reflected and reiterated the predominant values of the society and age in which they were embedded. Both Linnaeus and Keene described the African as indolent. So basically what they're saying here is that all throughout Europe, in all these different forms of media, in places, in spaces, in times, in novels, travel writings, jokes, kids' books, there were nasty and ugly descriptions of black people permeating all throughout the society. This was from the lower classes all the way up to the intellectuals. They were allowing all of that anti-blackness to fester within Europe in the late 19th century. Continuing here. An examination of just this one attribute, the myth of the lazy native, illustrates how the process of racialization was embedded in concrete historical processes of domination. When technologically advanced European adventurers and colonizers moved into Africa, they brought with them a capitalistic work ethic, a set of cultural attitudes towards clock time and systematic labor that was totally alien to the pastoral and agrarian economies of Africa. Europeans failed to recognize the hard labor involved in, for example, traditional patterns of extensive herding or hunting. Africans were thought to laze about in the tropical heat, occasionally lifting an indolent hand to pluck a banana from an ever-fertile forest, a fundamental reason why, since necessity is the mother of invention. It was argued that Africans had never built cities or achieved any degree of civilization. Whenever colonizers tried to harness African labor to their own ends in plantations, gold mines, and railway construction, they invariably met a high degree of resistance, not only to the violence deployed, but also to the very processes of unremitting, measured toil. Europeans, who regarded it as their natural right to dominate and exploit such primitive and backward peoples, viewed such opposition as perverse and an expression of the inherent laziness of all blacks. It is typical of the contradictory or irrational nature of racial stereotyping that such a fixed idea could be sustained despite the fact that the incalculable wealth produced by the labor of black plantation slaves was a foundation stone of West European ineradicably lazy. In turn, served an important ideological function and was used to legitimate the need for European masters to supervise and control the labor potential of primitive peoples, who, without such direction, would never lift themselves from savage torpor towards a civilized order. So basically what they're saying is like the Europeans came and they tried to make black people work on the plantations. They tried to colonize parts of Africa and enslave them on the continent. And when the Africans resisted, they fought back. They didn't work. They ran away. They tried to kill the master. They said, see, this is further proof that the African is lazy. Never mind the fact that we're sitting on our butts under the shade trying to dictate these men what to do. We have to be violent and cruel and wicked to get work done that we could be able to do ourselves. But that shows that the African is lazy. It shows how the mind of how whiteness twists the mind. Let's continue here. The myth of the lazy native, a key component of modern racism, like most racist stereotyping, tells us much more about the Eurocentric preoccupations of the dominant society, about the projections of white Europeans, than about the social reality of African society. Studies of racism which remain restricted to ideas about race will tend to exaggerate the autonomy of science and largely fail to locate the social, economic, and political processes that can explain such a phenomenon. The shift in the paradigm of racism in about circa 1860 to 1870 to a new form, the assertion of radical biological difference, was not to then a consequence of scientific innovation, but rather the reflection of a profound transformation in European society. However, this is not to argue that race science was simply an epiphenomenon and had no impact since. As Michel Foucault has shown, particular types of knowledge or discourse can also constitute a form of power. In a rapidly secularizing age of immense industrial and technical advance, science carried enormous prestige and powers of legitimation. This is one key reason why the arts of race, in order to carry conviction, needed to be reformulated in scientific rather than in traditional religious terms. Very interesting text right there. Very powerful paragraphs. I like all these paragraphs, man. This man he's spitting. These are bars. Neil MacMaster is spitting bars on this thing. And man, some of the quotes in here are hilarious. I swear, I'm going to say this every day. Anointed himself with grease, governed by caprice. I'm getting that tattooed on my forehead because anointed himself with grease, governed by caprice. Anointed himself with grease, governed by caprice. I'm putting that. I'm gonna post that real quick. I'm gonna post that real quick. Anoints himself. Hold on, wait. I have to do this. This is so lame, but I have to post this out before I get tired, because after this I'm going to bed. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. And yes, I know what caprice means before y'all tell me. It's like the love of gold. I learned that word very young because I had this badass broad that used to ride the school bus. Badass broad. Her name was Caprice. She was so bad. So yeah, shout out to Caprice. And also shout out to this racist white man that gave us a bar. Even though he is like trying to describe black people in a bad way, it's like still a bar though. I don't know why. That's such a bar. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. I'm gonna if I make a mixtape again, I'm gonna title it that. I'm sorry, I'm ranting. Anyway. Racism, Modernity, and the 1870 Turning Point. The simultaneous appearance of a modern exclusionary racism and its anti-black and anti-Semitic forms right across Europe after 1870 cannot therefore be adequately understood as a breakthrough in racist ideas alone, an innovative moment in science, but needs to be investigated within the broader context of social, political, economic, and cultural change. In particular, notes can be taken of 5 major factors that provided a particularly powerful impetus towards a modern form of racism: an anti-liberal shift in politics, a deep cultural pessimism that was a conservative reaction to the upheavals and dislocation produced by rapid economic and social change, the appearance of militarism and xenophobic nationalism linked to an age of growing international insecurity and competitiveness. When I see xenophobic nationalism, I just can't help but think of that white Canadian girl that said that to the face of Sam Cedar on that Jubilee video, like 25 crazy conservatives against a sane person. And yeah, she said, "What's wrong with xenophobic nationalism?" And I said, "Bitch, you from Canada. Get the fuck, what?" Anyway. The rapid expansion of the new imperialism and aggressive forms of colonialism, particularly in Africa, the extension of the popular franchise, and the growth of new mass party organizations in which, for the first time, matters of race, both of empire and of anti-Semitism, became mobilizing issues. Growing literacy and a revolution in mass communication technologies that enabled both racial texts and representations, from film to advertising, to be diffused with unparalleled force. We next provide a brief summary of these key factors, which will then be expanded upon in later chapters. Before doing so, however, it is important to note that the spread of capitalism, and the making of the bourgeoisie Europe was an uneven process, with some regions undergoing an early stage of industrialization, notably in Britain and parts of France, while other areas, southern and eastern Europe, remained predominantly underdeveloped peasant societies. This made a difference in the extent to which secular and modern forms of racism took root, but the impact of modernization was by 1870 and 1890 being felt even in the most backward zones. For example, the wave of anti-Semitic pogroms that spread across the Ukraine and Black Sea coast areas at the turn of the century, although still finding expression in more traditional Christian forms, Jews as deicides, was undoubtedly linked to the rapid economic growth of cities like Odessa. So basically what he's trying to say here is that, industrialization sort of motivated people to become more anti-Semitic or anti-Black or racist to some type of degree against some other group. And an example of that is what was happening in Ukraine when their southern port city, Odessa, started to modernize. Going to Ozzy, he says, "Salute, Simon. This is a great topic." Shout out to Ozzy as well. We're going to be continuing to read this book, and we're about to wrap this up soon because we're only reading 2 sections today. Let's continue. By 1870, in the close of what Hobsbawm has dubbed the Age of Capital, 1848 to 75, Europe was accelerating through an unprecedented series of changes that were driven by rapid industrialization, the spread of steam power across the continent, the growth of factory and mining towns, and the migration of land workers into urban centers. The pace of change can be illustrated by the extremely rapid growth in cities. Between 1850 and 1900, the population of London increased from 2.3 to 6.4 million, Paris from 1.3 to 3.3 million, Berlin from 446,000 to 2.4 million. That's insane. Hamburg from 193,000 to 895,000, although this could be seen as the age in which the bourgeoisie was triumphant, possessing an unprecedented degree of wealth and power. It was also, as Marx showed in detail, a period of immense social stress and insecurity. The bourgeoisie felt threatened from below by the growth of a vast and oppressed proletariat, which was beginning to convert to socialism or anarchism, and to organize in trade unions and mass political parties. Bourgeoisie confidence in the onward march of capital was severely dented by the stock exchange crash of 1873, a crisis that inspired a strong anti-Semitic reaction, and by the Great Depression that lasted through to the 1890s. Rapid economic transformation meant that numerous social groups, from traditional landowner aristocracies to peasants and handcraft workers, were faced with inevitable decline and the disintegration of an old, rural, or small-town society that was seen through a haze of nostalgia and regret. The disruptive impacts of capitalism created the conditions under which many groups and organizations, profoundly disturbed by modernism, responded by seeking stability and solace in a conservative or reactive agenda. It was these groups who were able to prove susceptible to the appeal of racism, and in particular to anti-Semitism, which targeted the Jews as the enemy within, seen as responsible for both the growth of speculative and commercial capitalism that was parasitic on the honest labor of European peoples, and for the subversion of the existing order via the secretive organization of socialist and revolutionary movements. So basically what he's trying to say here is, like, as capitalism was developing rapidly towards the end of the 19th century, some people got left behind. So the capitalist class, being the reason that people got left behind, didn't say, hey, sorry, in this new system, guys, we're going to pay y'all basically a substandard wage. You're barely going to be able to get by and live on the money we give you as we get richer and richer. But you know who's really the problem? It's the Jews. It's the blacks. It's them. So the capitalists have been running this place since the beginning of the era of capitalism. Right? But yeah, we've been susceptible to it since then. And some people have been woken up and shaken, but still some people have false consciousness and really think it's the immigrant, the Jew, the enemy within who is keeping them down and oppressed, rather than it is the capitalists themselves. Let's continue here. A powerful conservative and anti-liberal politics began to spread across the face of Europe after 1870, from Berlin to Moscow, in opposition to the laissez-faire Manchester ideology of free trade, held as responsible for the depredations of unregulated capitalism. Among conservative elites, the disintegration of the old order and its hierarchical certainties was characterized by nostalgia for a mythical rural or volkish past, in which grateful peasants were bound by mutual ties to protective lords, a society rooted in tradition, the ways of ancestors, and hallowed by strong religious faith. Thus, although today we are often struck by the triumphalism and splendor of late Victorian Europe, the apparent self-confidence of its grand architectural statements, for many elites, this was not the age of progress and certainty, but of profound pessimism and of what Fritz Stern has aptly named cultural despair. The disquiet with modernism was widely translated into fin de siècle pessimism that regarded the European civilization as threatened from within by a process of physiological and racial degeneration. So even at the beginning of capitalism, when people were getting wildly rich, people were saying, we're going to end soon. It's all going to collapse. It's all going to fall. That's why I never click on those videos or fell into that rabbit hole that the U.S. empire is about to fall, or the world is collapsing, the West is losing, China is on the rise. I never got into that, all that, the U.S. dollar is going to go become worthless tomorrow, brother, buy gold, because it's always in the mindset of those people. And I realized this very early on. People at the top always have this paranoia of falling off, and they want everybody else scared too, because misery loves company. But empire, we don't know when the hour will come. Of course, every empire falls. Nothing lasts forever. Every state will eventually dissipate and all that sort of stuff. But it's not likely that it's going to be happening in our lifetimes, that we'll see the end of the U.S. empire and stuff like that. But anything can happen. But I'm not saying it's going to be here forever. But it's very unlikely that, all the fear mongering that they talk about is actually real. Let's continue here. So the work of Count Gobineau, I wrote a paper about this, Essays in the Inequalities of the Human Races. I wrote an essay about this for the anthropology professor I was telling you about last semester. Anyway, Gobineau's Essays on the Inequalities of the Races of Humans, published in 1853, was a key precursor of this late 19th century trend, founded as it was on profound remorse for a declining aristocratic order, a nostalgia that was translated into racial terms. In particular, the crisis of civilization and degeneration was expressed as a profound fear of interbreeding with lower race class types, a sexual phantasm of pollution and intermingling that could only be contained through projects of segregation, exclusion, or elimination. As Benedict Anderson states, white racism dreams of eternal contaminations transmitted from the origins of time through an endless sequence of loathsome copulation. It was this anxiety that inspired the evolution towards racial eugenics and what Foucault has termed biopower, state strategies to maximize the demographic potential and efficiency of the nation. A second fundamental aspect of modern racism was its integral association with the rise of nationalism. As we have seen, the nation-state, like racism, developed as an imagined community, which was defined through the elaboration of boundaries that determined who did or did not belong to the people. From the late 15th century onwards, monarchies throughout Europe engaged in dynamic processes of state formation that extended power over peripheral regions and minorities, and attempted to enforce a homogeneous space of belonging through the elimination of minority languages, the imposition of religious orthodoxy, uniform and centralized bureaucracies, and other processes. This process of nationalization began to assume a proto-fascist form in Spain at a very early stage with the total exclusion of Jews and Moriscos in 1492. I have to say this, and I still stand by this. Nationalism necessitates fascism. Nationalism necessitates fascism. You cannot have a nation state, doesn't matter what nation state it is, without some degree of fascism within it. If you're willing to kill your other fellow human being over a imaginary boundary line, then that is fascism. That is fascism. And I'm standing on that. The nation state is not a good thing, and I can't wait until we're past the age of it, right? Probably won't be in my lifetime, but let it be known, future historians, hey, there were people here living at the time that did not like nationalism. They did not like the nation state. The statuses on the purity of blood, which were enforced by the Spanish Inquisition between 1449 and 1834, have been frequently interpreted as an unusually early form of racism in that new Christians, in spite of conversion, remained indelibly tainted with Jewish or Moorish blood from one generation to the next. I said this before in the live stream. Before they caught the black African, they were doing racism for thousands of years in Europe, essentializing people by blood. However, the concept of indelible staining derived from both a biblical tradition of the impure as well as from the aristocratic ideology of lineage, the avoidance of misalliance and marriage outside the group of noble blood that should not be confused with modern forms of biological racism. So what he's trying to say is not the same as biological racial essentialism. It was not until the late 18th century that the first signs of a racialized nationalism began to appear. The revolutionary shift from dynastic states in the possession of monarchs to nation states constituted by citizens/people saw an abandonment of an older concept of race that was founded on the aristocratic principle of lineage, the transmission of hereditary good blood, and the prevention of misalliance and tainting, controlled by strict rules of class endogamy and genealogical tables. In the 19th century, the model of group purity that operated at the level of family, the lineage, or the dynasty was extended outwards to encompass the boundaries of the nation state. As Stella Cottrell has noted, the language of the new forms of British patriotism that appeared after 1800 was one of pedigree, lineage, ancestry, and nobility, in which the historic continuity of the nation/people was expressed as the British blood that flows in our veins. Hence, the discourse of modern racism was, and continues to be, suffused with a much older language that defined the rules of belonging through notions of blood, fictive kinship, the nation as family, and a horror of miscegenation and tainting by tainting by inferior groups. Sorry. All right. What the modern form of racism provided after mid-century was a powerful ideological means of expressing a much more rigidly defined nationalism. The boundaries of the national community could be policed in a far more absolute way, since those others who were regarded as alien, Jews, Gypsies, the Irish, blacks, could never be assimilated or cross over, since they were locked into an ineradicable biological difference. A distinctive watershed appeared during the 1880s as Western states, including the USA and white dominions, moved from an earlier liberal phase in relation to international migration towards increasingly restrictive controls at national borders. Nation building involved new passport regimes, work quotas, and other bureaucratic mechanisms for the policing of territory and the exclusion of aliens seen as racially incompatible. By 1870, the Romantic phase of national liberation, of heroic Polish struggle against Russia, of Greek against Turk, of Italian unification, was giving way to a phase of growing tension and insecurity between the major European powers. Britain, France, Germany, and Russia significantly. Shout out to Ozzy as well. Shout out to Ozzy for the $5 super chat. $5 super chat from Ozzy. Thank you, Ozzy, for that. I appreciate that. And yeah, that's going to go towards putting out more work, reading these books. Shout out to Ozzy, man. That's his first super chat, man. I appreciate that. Much love to Ozzy. Much love, man. Much love to Ozzy. Much love to you, man. Anyway, let's continue here. So, basically what he's talking about here is like after, the nation state came into being, they had to essentialize it. They had to say, now that we are a nation, it's in your blood that you're Greek, you're German, you're Jewish, you're Turkish, whatever, right? And that's once again what I'm saying. The nation state necessitates fascism to be within it. You have to essentialize some people as being the out group, making others out of others, even if they are literally the same as you, because we are all the same. We are all one human family, right? Anyway. So, this was giving way to a phase of growing tension and insecurity between the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. Significantly, as these antagonisms deepened, the science of race shifted from a preoccupation with the global categorization of non-European races and a simple unified concept of European, white, Caucasian identity to an internal racism that began to elaborate an increasingly complex subdivision into distinct European types: Aryan, Celt, Nordic, Mediterranean, Alpine, ... Nationalistic ideologues began to express growing international tensions inside the boundaries of Europe in the language of race and of social Darwinism. However, the obsessive drive towards an integral nationalism, one that could assure the external strength of the state in international conflict only through an internal cohesion based on racial purity, was to find its most widespread formulation through political anti-Semitism. Right across Europe, the Jews, regardless of their numerical presence, were regarded as stateless other, a racial group that threatened the integrity of the host society, since their hereditary values would always tie their allegiance to international forces, capitalism, socialism, Freemasonry, liberalism, etc., that were perceived to present the greatest danger to national survival. It's so interesting that at the beginning of the nation state, they viewed other organizational types of nationhood as oppositional to nationalism. Nowadays, we believe that the nation state and capitalism, for example, or neoliberal free market enterprise, is an essential part of the nation state project. That's what we tend to believe. We tend to believe that. But when we think about it, actually, they aren't necessarily one and one. The nation state can take on many different forms. It could be a socialist state, a capitalist state, a liberal state, neoliberal state, an anarchic state, if that's even possible. Anarchic state to some degree. I'm sure you could think of a concept of the anarchic state, a federation, right? There's many different forms, but they viewed the Jews as being beholden to Freemasonry. Didn't the Masons not even allow Jews to enter? I don't know. So, while national antagonisms were often racialized, the English dislike for the Irish, the German for the Pole, the French for the Italian, these were restricted and nation-specific. What distinguished the Jews from all other groups, apart from the Gypsies, was that they constituted a truly international insider. A third major feature of the period after 1870, integrally linked to the surge of aggressive nationalism, was the growth of the new imperialism. In particular, the scramble for Africa led to a remarkably rapid partition of the continent between 1880 and 1912. The involvement of a considerable number of old and new imperial states in this process, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Denmark, meant that maritime West European societies were inevitably affected by colonial propaganda and by forms of racism that were tied to the imperial mission. The fact that colonial expansion and intra-European competition was so much centered on the dark continent during this period meant that media attention and racist propaganda was focused on the image of the black, the same aggressive and defensive form of nationalism that gave rise to militarism, patriotism, and a search for national efficiency internal to Europe, also inspired the extension of the contest out beyond the boundaries of Europe in the struggle to seize colonial territories and to control their raw materials, markets, and labor power. The French newspaper Le Temps commented, after the shock of the defeat of Prussia, or the defeat by Prussia in 1871, cruelly defeated in Europe, we must look for compensation elsewhere. So basically, what he's trying to say is that in Europe, the Europeans were somewhat dividing themselves into different races, the Alpines, the Caucasoids, the Celts, etc., etc. They were dividing themselves into races and also warring with each other on the continent, which they have done for centuries. And when they would lose a war, like when the French lost to the Germans in 1871, they said, damn, we got beat up by some damn Germans. Let's go brutalize some Africans. We need to get rewards elsewhere. Let's colonize Algeria. That was their thinking. That's the way they thought. They were taking their race war and bringing everybody else in it. The Europeans had a race war amongst themselves for centuries, and now they wanted to bring the race war globalized. They want to take it worldwide. They're going on a world tour with the mic in their hand. Anyway, continuing here. Throughout the age of the new imperialism, circa 1875 to 1914, as well as into the interwar period, European powers in Africa engaged in an oppressive racial praxis, systematic and legalized brutality, and segregation, widespread killings, and genocidal wars, from the Belgian atrocities in the Congo and the German extermination of the Herero in Southwest Africa to the Italian campaign in Ethiopia, that inevitably had an impact on civilized metropolitan societies. In this study, we are concerned primarily with racism as it developed internal to Europe, and space does not allow a fuller treatment of the colonial sphere. But clearly, the direct contact with Africans overseas and the development of a complex apparatus of institutionalized racism backed up imperial ideologies of racial superiority and a major impact on metropolitan society. Colonial societies were not only the originators of discriminatory ideologies, such as elaborate codes to prevent miscegenation, but far more crucially, they provided the context in which racial practices were implemented through tough legal systems, oppressive policing regimes, segregation, and a host of other measures. The colonial societies were not only the originators of discriminatory ideologies, such as elaborate codes to prevent miscegenation, but far more crucially, they provided the context in which racial practices were implemented through tough legal systems, oppressive policing regimes, segregation, and a host of other measures. So the colonies were like little science projects. Hey, what can we do to stop the races from mixing? Or how can we police an entire minority ethnic group? How can we create concentration camps like the Germans did in Namibia before they did it to the Jews during the Holocaust? How can we create a concentration camp to systematically slaughter a group of people? Let's practice it on the Hereros in Namibia. You get what I'm saying? So Ozzy says, but they want to call us savages. Exactly. Like, we never traveled across seas. We never hopped in a boat, put a bunch of white folks in a camp, and then let them be killed by us systematically. We didn't colonize all of France and cut their hands off because they couldn't pick enough rubber from trees. We didn't do any of that. And yet and still the whole world runs around yelling, nigger. The whole world runs around yelling Zenchi and Zezek and Abid and Wusif and all this sort of stuff. They run around saying all this stuff about us and have all sorts of anti-black slurs about us in every single country. And we ain't did none of this shit. We ain't import millions of Turks to Africa and cut their dicks off. We ain't do none of that. We ain't do none of that. But the whole world got smoked for us. Whole world got smoke for us. This is why we have to be, this is why we're on one team, one page, and we have no friends. We have no friends and we have no allies. No friends, no allies. Facts, facts, facts. Let's continue here. So, all right. Colonial societies were not only the originators of discriminatory ideologies such as elaborate codes to prevent miscegenation, but far more crucially, they provided the context in which racial practices were implemented through tough legal systems, oppressive policing regimes, segregation, and a host of other measures. In the period after 1870, many colonial regimes from South Africa to Indonesia and Algeria witnessed a shift from more benign towards more oppressive forms of racist regime. This racism flowed back and impacted on metropolitan societies through numerous channels, from the impact of pro-imperialist propaganda and political leagues to the career circulation between Europe and overseas of numerous colonial state officials, army officers, missionaries, academics, and businessmen who brought home racist attitudes. As Ann Stoler has argued, colonial empires acted as laboratories of modernity, testing grounds and models for the European bourgeoisie order. They were science projects. Continuing here. Fourthly, the racialization of European politics after 1870 coincided with the growth of new forms of mass political organization. Between the 1860s and 1914, there was a drive toward electoral reform and the extension of the vote throughout Europe. Although universal male suffrage was introduced in a piecemeal way, Imperial Germany 1871, Britain 1867 and 1885, Belgium 1893, Finland 1906, Italy 1912, the size of electorates increased dramatically. The gradual extension of the vote to lower middle class and working class males was accompanied by the growth of mass political parties that began to develop new organizational structures and forms of popular agitation. In some national contexts, as in France during the Dreyfus crisis, in Germany and Austria after 1879, and in England at the turn of the century, this could have a dramatic impact on the politicization of anti-Semitism. For the first time in modern Europe, race became a mobilizing issue, a concern that could begin to have a dramatic impact on the behavior of the voting public. The period, 1870 to 1914, also saw the proliferation of an immense number of campaigning organizations, of leagues and associations that were dedicated to imperialist and racist propaganda, from the British Primrose League, 1883, to the Imperial Federation League and the Empire League, to German organizations like the Pan-German League and the Navy League. The growing comfort and rapidity of transport systems of train, tram, and automobile accelerated mobility and encouraged the movement of propagandists, as well as the regular meeting and exchange of ideas between anti-Semites, race scientists, and eugenicists in annual conferences and colloquia, both nationally and at the European level. For example, the first International Anti-Jewish Congress, held in Dresden in 1882, was attended by delegates from various parts of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, while the Second International at Chemnitz the following year attracted representatives from Austria, Hungary, Russia, Romania, Serbia, and France. Basically, what he's saying here is, like, at the same time, the vote was expanding and industrialization was happening and all this infrastructure was being laid down that allowed people to travel more easily and capital to flow across borders and boundaries. The race science was being developed. The anti-Semitism was becoming more virulent. People were coming back from the colonial spaces where they were the administrator of the Kenyan affairs back to Europe and saying, hey, the Africans are less than human. I saw it with my own eyes. And all the other white folks at the wine party say, oh, you know what I mean? So the ideas are spreading at the same time capital is expanding, is what he's getting at. Finally, and linked closely to the emergence of mass politics, was the spread of education and of new technologies of communication. Primary education expanded considerably during the late 19th century, and adult illiteracy declined between 1870 and 1900 in the Austrian Empire from 50% to 23%, in France from 31% to 17%, in Belgium from 31% to 19%, although levels remained high in Italy, 69% to 40%. 48%. In Spain, 72% to 56%. And in Russia and Poland, 81% and 74% in 1897. The creation of a literate mass readership revolutionized popular culture and vastly increased the channels through which colonial and racist ideas could be diffused. Technical changes, including rotary presses, mechanized typesetting, and photographic reproduction, opened the way to a cheap mass circulation press. By 1914, modern machines could print 50,000 copies of a 12-page newspaper in an hour, and the circulation of the popular Daily Mail, for example, increased from 400,000 copies in 1898 to 1 million in 1901. While Le Petit Parisien went from 690,000 copies in 1890 to 1.4 million in 1914, this period also saw an enormous proliferation of visual materials, from postcards and advertisements to cigarette cards, that reproduced racist images of barbarous fuzzy wuzzies, cannibals, and naked savages, or of evil hook-nosed Jews bent on world conquest. School textbooks, children's adventure stories, popular national histories, and missionary leaflets became a vehicle for the depiction of the victorious civilizing mission of the white races that were taking modernity and enlightenment to the savage. The commercial cinema expanded with a phenomenal speed after 1898, and by 1917, British audiences had reached 20 million a week in some 4,000 cinemas. So once again, it's mind-boggling to think about the rapid speed of change at the end of the 19th century. Most people for most of human history were illiterate. They couldn't read. They didn't know what was happening on the other side of town if you gave them a paper that said exactly what happened. But now at the same time that these factories are popping up, these cities are being developed, goods are traveling across boundaries, and massive colonies are being created by these countries in far-off flung lands, people are also learning how to read. Not a lot of people, but more than what was definitely before. They're picking up the newspaper, and what are they seeing in the newspaper? The N-word and anti-Semitic pictures and racist depictions of other people that are not them and all sorts of wicked stuff. Imagine the first book you give a child is Mein Kampf. Imagine the first book you give your teenage daughter is the Turner Diaries. That's essentially what people were reading back then. They were reading the most racist, vile stuff by our standards today. They were just reading that in the newspaper. Like the news about what King Wilhelm is up to, and then you flip the next page and you see a black man in the caricature of a monkey, right on the newspaper. That's what the people were reading, and we're not even talking about the movie theaters where they were doing blackface in the cinema. It's astounding. It's astounding. I'm so astounded. I'm so astounded that I'm sick. I have to blow my nose. Woo-wee! Covered myself in grease, governed by caprice. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. Anoints himself with grease and governed by caprice. If anybody comes on and says I'm shiny ever on my live streams, I'm going to say I'm governed. I covered myself with grease and I'm governed by caprice. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. That's such a sick bar. Such a sick bar. Anyway, historians, it can be noted in conclusion, disagree among themselves as to the period in time when racism first began to manifest itself. Some date it back over a millennia as an almost universal feature of human societies. Others point to the beginnings of European global expansion and conquest from the 14th century and the beginnings of capitalism, while a third and fourth group center consecutively on the growth of Enlightenment science in the 18th century or the rapid growth of industrialization and nationalism in the 19th century. Such disagreement is a significant reflection of varying definitions, a lack of clear agreement as to what precisely is under discussion. There cannot be a universal definition of racism that will hold true for all periods of history, and even for all societies at the same moment in time, simply because racist ideologies are plastic in form, continually being reworked and modified and made positive under different historical conditions. However, such a position runs the danger of total relativism. While our argument argument that it makes sense to talk of racisms rather than a singular racism still raises the problem that differing modalities of race as subsets of a general category must still share some common features to make such an identification possible. One answer to this conundrum, and adopted throughout this study, is to accept an ideal typical definition that restricts racism to those belief systems which categorize individuals in a deterministic way, whether expressed through biology or culture, such that they were incapable of moving from one social position to another. A systematization of essential groups difference, one that broke away from older concepts of race as lineage, appeared with Enlightenment science. What distinguished the late 19th century was not so much the elaboration of a new science of race, in spite of all the talk of Darwinian revolution, but rather the sheer speed with which a discourse of radical biological difference was diffused within European society and became an almost universally accepted way of thinking about history and contemporary politics and national identity. The following 3 chapters, Part 1, explore the way in which this modern form of racism established a solid foundation within Europe between 1870 and the outbreak of the First World War. So, we're going to jump into chapter 1 in our next live stream. We're going to wrap this up right here. We're going to finish right here. Basically, what he's saying is that it's not so surprising that racist ideas were permeating, right? Because Europe had a lot of time to develop them and work on them and experience them, right? From, all their years of dealing with the Jews and the Gypsies and the Moors and all this sort of stuff. By the way, I find it interesting the Moors didn't really come up because I believe they would play a big part in the European psychological formation on race. But basically he's saying that what's surprising more than just the creation of racist narratives is how quickly they diffused in society. And it's like they came at the right place at the right time. And it's simply because of mass media. The Europeans were reading newspapers where they were getting just racist imagery pushed down their throats by the ruling class, who were promoting this narrative as a way to divide the working class, right? So, we're going to start chapter 1, part 1, 1870 to 1914 in our next reading, which will be tomorrow. We might not be able to finish all of part 1 or chapter 1. We're going to read as much of it as we can. So we're going to try to get like a few of the sections down, and I'll let you know what we do tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. We'll start on this. This is your boy, anointed himself with grease, governed by caprice, a.k.a. Simon Hill Keeps It Trill, a.k.a. Delks Moses, a.k.a. Mr. Read 'em All. Gotta read 'em all. And let me give a shout out to my guy Ozzy. Shout out to Ozzy for his first super chat, $5. Anything is appreciated. I really, really thank you. Really, really thank you for that. I just got to let you know, it's better to donate to the PayPal. I want to let everybody know, if you really want to donate to this channel and help your boy out, it's better to donate to the PayPal rather than to YouTube. Donate to the PayPal rather than the YouTube, because YouTube takes about 30%. So you give me $5, I'm left with like $3 or so, something like that. And by the way, I'm still thankful. I'm not mad at anybody, but I'm letting you know, if you really want to get money to me and not to YouTube, send it to the PayPal first, because PayPal is the way that you can better, support it and get it in my hands. And I promise to spend it wisely. I know everybody works hard for their money, and I'm working hard just to bring education to the people. And so that's what we're going to keep doing. So this has been part 2 of reading Racism in Europe by Neil MacMaster. Let me give a shout out once again to Ozzy and anybody who's going to catch this on the